topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the host and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
What's working on purpose anyway? Each week, we ponder the answer to this question. People ache for meaning and purpose at work, to contribute their talents passionately and know their lives really matter. They crave being part of an organization that inspires them and helps them grow into realizing their highest potential. Business can be such a force for good in the world, elevating humanity. In our program, we provide guidance and inspiration to help usher in this world we all want, working on purpose. Now, here's your host, Dr. Elise Cortez.
Welcome back to the Working on Purpose program, which has been brought to you with passion and pride since February of 2015. Thanks for tuning in again this week. Great to have you. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. If we've not met before and you don't know me, I'm an organizational psychologist, management consultant, logotherapist, speaker, and author. My team and I at Gusto now help companies to enliven and fortify their operations by building a dynamic, high-performance culture and inspirational leadership activated by meaning and purpose. Did you know that inspired employees outperform their satisfied peers by a factor of 2.25 to 1? In other words, inspiration is good for the bottom line. You can learn more about us and how we can work together at gusto-now.com or my personal site, elisecortez.com. Now, getting today's program, we have with us Tonille Miller, a seasoned executive management consultant and organizational psychologist specializing in transformation, organizational effectiveness, and human performance. She is passionate about creating thriving ecosystems where businesses succeed because people are empowered to do their best work of their lives. She's the author of The Flourishing Effect, Unlocking Employee Thriving as Your Competitive Advantage, which is a playbook for cultivating an environment where engagement, agility, and high performance thrive. We'll be talking about various aspects from her book, including learning from history to create companies and work experiences that inspire rather than repel, the disconnect from the perspective of those in the workforce and what work feels like for most people, and how companies and leaders can rise to meet the needs of today's evolved workforce while succeeding mightily. She joins us from New York. Tonille, welcome to Working on Purpose.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you. As I told you, we are really quite aligned, and I loved every single last word of your book. I'm so excited to help bring this to our listeners and viewers. First, I got to start by saying your introduction, Tonille, is one of the best introductions I've ever read in a book. I was so excited and inspired by it. So let's let the secret into our listeners and viewers as well. You open with a fascinating historical account of the Black Plague and the Italian Renaissance, and then you situate its parallel in our COVID pandemic and the promise of today's world of work. So let's start there.
Yes. Thank you so much, first of all, for having me. I've been excited about this since we first chatted. So the thing is I'm always listening to podcasts like this one, like others, like a lot of us are. And when I was writing the book, I was listening to this podcast about the Renaissance, and I noticed the parallels right away between the society at that point in time emerging from the Black Plague and our recent pandemic. And the more that I dove in, I started to research it, and I just was seeing all these parallels and understanding that like what was taking place at that time across the world. It seemed like there were so many similarities, and which really led to an inspiring result, right? So the Renaissance, obviously so much talent, so much innovation and things happened during that time. And I thought, gosh, what a really great, interesting message that we can tie the parallels to what they did at the end of the plague before the Renaissance, and we can tie those parallels to maybe give us some hope in this moment, right? When we're emerging from the pandemic, when I wrote this about 2 years ago. So in many ways, this moment is similar, as I talk about in the book, in the sense that, you know, at that time, society had really outgrown those old institutions, old beliefs, old ways of being, yet it was really stuck in kind of this moment, this morass, right, from the Black Plague, which had halted commerce and travel and learning and innovation. So it was kind of like in this stuck point, kind of like in that liminal stage, right? And I feel like right when we came out of the pandemic, when I wrote this, it's like we kind of were in a similar point in time where it's like, well, we're definitely not in Kansas anymore, but we don't know where we're going to be next. And so I kind of wanted to pull these parallels and then say, hey, by the way, this has happened before. Let's take some lessons from the past. And I thought it was great to pull on what the Medici family did at that point in time when they rose to power, because they did that through really anticipating and fostering that environment that nurtured, empowered, and inspired those great talent of the Renaissance. So I thought, wow, that's pretty cool. Why don't we apply that to our modern environment, right? These are some things that leaders can actually do. And as I really researched like some of the things that they did, I thought, gosh, that's a lot of what I'm talking about in this book. It's a lot of that meeting the human needs aspect. So that's really where I got that.
Beautiful, Tonille. Great way to open. I was so inspired by that story. And I love when we can go back in history and learn from that. And I think that is a very powerful opening for our listeners and viewers, anyone who reads your book, because when you see what happened from that, I think that opens something. It helps us maybe get unstuck from how we're clinging to our old ways of doing things and see possibilities that are really, really grand. And that's what I want too.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about just really how it is that you are on this journey yourself. Why aren't you, in accounting or architecture? You've chosen this particular path. So why this background, why this kind of work, and why this journey you're taking us on?
Yeah, I mean, like a lot of folks, I grew up with a single parent. I, for the most part, basically grew up with a single mom, and she juggled, for the most of my life, 2 to 3 jobs at a time to make ends meet. And so watching that as a little girl and really observing how much time and energy that took away from her and from me as a child and my brother, basically, I didn't like it. And I was like, that just seems weird. That doesn't seem how it should be. And, ever since that time, I kind of became acutely aware of how work had dominated most people's lives, not just hers, but most people, no matter what type of work it was. And also how rare it was that somebody would say, wow, I love my job. I love what I'm doing. And so I kind of always had that in the back of my mind growing up. And then I thought, there's got to be a way to fix this, right? Because work takes so much time, energy, lifeblood, et cetera, away from all of us. And so I kind of started thinking, well, this is a really big problem to solve. We all, for the most part, have to work. So I started out, as a researcher, as a management consultant, and IO psychologist and coach for these companies, trying to kind of figure out, like, what is it that makes work so terrible in many cases, right? Like why is it bad when it's bad, and why is it good when it's good? And so I always was kind of leading with that and picking up pieces of the puzzle as I went along of, like, employee well-being and employee engagement and leadership and change management, all these different things that I see as really kind of different pieces of the puzzle or the system and how they work together. And when they work and they do some amazing things that I know we're going to talk about. And when they don't work, they don't work. And we're going to talk about those things as well. And so picking up those pieces as I went along, I just thought, wow, this is really fascinating. And a lot of people don't get it. Like, we all know that we have our gripes about work, or somebody's like the lucky person, and I love my job, but we don't really know why that is. And so I really wanted to dig into that in this book.
I love it. Very similar. I grew up on a farm with farmers who, I was raised with the idea that work is a noble thing. It's the way that we go through life. It is what we do in service of our life. It's not something we had to slog through. And two, I noticed, that's part of my research too, is part of the reason I started hosting the show is I wanted people to know that people could actually really be passionate about what they do for work. And that's how it started 10 years ago. Anyway, so such strong parallels, Tonille.
Very much.
So, you and I know this because we're researchers and we talk about this, but it's so hard for people to understand how much the ways of working for so many people aren't working. And you have some very interesting stats in the book that I think, even if we just share a few of those, it will help our listeners and viewers understand the gravity of the problem. Can you share a few of them?
Yeah, absolutely. So we get into a lot of research in this book because, just like you,
Yeah.
you got to ground it in the research. And I think it's helpful too, because when you read it, if people are HR practitioners or managers, it's always helpful to ground whatever you're trying to do in your organization or tell your leader you should do, ground it in the data. We know that that's kind of the door into doing what you want to do. So I think a couple of the things that really come to mind is just when you think about, like, how the old formulas, don't work anymore. I think a lot of organizations, kind of what's not working is that they're trying to apply these old ways of thinking that were, really built 150 years ago, back on the factory floors. And even before that, they're trying to still apply those ways of thinking to the current environment, which really presents, I think, kind of a distorted experience or a distorted reality for people that are in the workplace. And so that's one of the things, just to keep that in mind as your back pocket. But then also, I think when you think about some of these operating from the outdated social contract, right? So I think we all are pretty aware that the days when people dedicated their careers to a single organization, and in return, they got predictable raises, bonuses, and a pension. I think we all know that that's kind of gone. Unfortunately, that's not really happening anymore because there's no pensions for the most part. Wages are underwhelming. Companies are perfectly comfortable laying people off as soon as their profits dip below a certain margin. And so I think that because that contract isn't valid anymore, but yet we're still operating from that, I think that also causes a real kind of rift in like the reality of like, what are we doing here? And so I think there's some of those just different pieces that's kind of like the foundational level. So those are just things to kind of kick us off with. And then that's even pre-pandemic, right? And then now coming out of the pandemic, I mean, it's obviously been a while now, but essentially leaders, as we're seeing in the media, are now, again, continuing for 5 years, trying to force people to, return to the office and do all these things. And we're just like, guys, we're not there anymore. It wasn't working leading up to the pandemic. And now it's definitely not working. We're definitely in a new world. We know we can work differently. We've proved it, that kind of thing. And because leaders aren't adapting to that, I think that that's us obviously also kind of causing a rift there as well with folks.
Mm-hmm. Which we're going to dive more into as well, and after the break in the second segment. But I also want to point out something that's really, really important that I think our listeners and viewers really need to understand. That's so important of your book. And you talk about it's the march toward irrelevancy and non-existence, right? So when you embrace these old ways of working and these old formulas, you are ripe for disruption. I think that's really important to understand. If you could say more about that.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So again, it's kind of tricky to talk about this sometimes because I know we're doing this real time and things are changing real time in our world versus, 10 years ago, you could write about something and it would be relevant, right? For about a couple of years at least, right? Now we're updating it moment to moment. So I say that because there's a lot of things there, right? So there's the work practices, which we'll get into more of those in more depth, I'm sure, as we've talked about some of them, like the return to office, all that stuff. But also a lot of it is really leaders specifically. If you think about just like, if you look at the stats of like how much income level, lived experience, gender, race, all that, like the CEO, the average C-level leader doesn't look or have a lived experience that's similar to their average employee for the most part. So there's a disconnect there too, where they're like, oh, I know what my people want. I know what they need. They got to get back in the office. That's how, it's like that gap is getting wider and wider every day. And then also, again, with technology, it's like people live in a world where like they have, Netflix and Spotify and Amazon catering to their every need. And then they go to work and it feels like 1985 on the inside. And that's a big disconnect too. So there's all these things that I'm sure we'll dive into next, but it's all these things where just organizations, the way they operate from these old school ways of working just are not relevant to people anymore. And so a lot of folks, as we're seeing, are really jumping into the gig economy and some other structures.
Mm-hmm. I really thought it was powerful, Tonille, the way that you really pointed that out, that, people have now gotten so used to a life where they can order anything they want from Amazon. It's there the next day or this afternoon, or, the whole Netflix experience. And it's just everything. And there's so much quality around them. And then to your point, now we go back to work or the office. And to your point, it feels like 1985. I think that's a really important point for listeners, viewers, and readers to really understand about this major disconnect. So wanted to just hammer that home. I want to also talk a little bit about this idea of really, and I appreciate that part of what you're really focused on is experience. What you're saying here, since we have so many more options for ways to make money these days, and people are not trusting, that they're going to have a job, for forever, they're exploring other ways. And so you say companies need to offer a compelling experience that the ever-evolving workforce can't find elsewhere. And that takes a lot of work. And I want to make sure, listeners and viewers, that you don't feel like we're talking at you or down to you. This leading today is one of the hardest jobs in the whole entire world. And we're here to help. Yep. So if you could say a little something about, some of this, these ways, so the solution you see people doing side hustles and the gig economy, entrepreneurship, multiple streams of income. But if you could say a little bit about, this idea of enticing through this experience, going back and learning from the Medicis, the Renaissance, and how they really created this whole other world. What might this improved experience look like?
Oh, yes. No, it's so good. And there's so many things too. And here's the other part too, that I'll bring up too, because I think it's important, is it's not just a lot of things that we're going to talk about, but these are like pretty much low, no cost things. Most of the book is a lot of practical stuff that doesn't cost a thing, or it's very little.
Right.
So we can't, the leaders don't have any excuse of like, oh, that's too expensive. No, it's not. It's literally just being deliberate. It's not expensive. So all kinds of things. But the way that I frame it up in the book is I kind of frame it in terms of meeting people's human needs and not frustrating those needs, which again, we'll talk about shortly, I'm sure, of like what things cause that and that sort of thing. But again, what the Medicis did, which is very similar to what we're talking about, is if you think about like needs for meaning and purpose, needs for connection, well-being, we have actualization or growth, that kind of thing. So autonomy, another one. So these are all things, and we can get into some real practical ways to do it, but it's like meeting these needs and removing any of the friction, which we can talk a lot about. There's a lot of friction in the organization.
Yep, we will.
Right. And so doing that type of thing is exactly what the Medicis did. So they literally, just a quick note for those who don't know, like a lot of just like overview of the things they did for these folks is, again, they were patrons of these artists, right? So they kind of took care of their living expenses. They gave them a place to live, and maybe they didn't pay them a ton of money sometimes, but they had all their basic needs taken care of. So that's off the table. So they can actually use their brain and their energy to be creative and innovative and not stress every day, which the average employee, even a year or two ago, it was like this, but especially now, I mean, we talk about the price of eggs, we talk about everything. We're not getting political, but the point is the average employee is not, the wages have not cut up. We'll just say that, right? The wages have not cut up with them surviving and living. So I guarantee you, when I'm stressing about, can I pay my rent? Can I afford to go to the doctor? Can I afford my prescriptions? Can I afford this childcare, all this stuff? I'm definitely not giving you my best at work. So there's that well-being piece that's taken care of as a foundation. If you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's towards the bottom. Then we talk about, psychological safety, creating that kind of environment and organization. The Medicis did that as well, right? Like really giving people the autonomy to go and use their genius. What do you want to create? I don't care. I'm going to fund you. You go do you, because we know that you're good at what you do. And that's why we hired you in the organization. So that kind of stuff is really important. And again, offering different growth and meaning and purpose needs. And the other part too, that was really cool about the Medicis, and organizations can easily do this lots of ways, is they created kind of an artist community. So it was really kind of a cool thing of being part of these few people that were patroned by the Medicis. And it was like this cool artist community. There's lots of salons and lots of things where they go and they interact together and they trade stories, and some of them were competitive, like Michelangelo and Da Vinci, as we probably all know. So there's all these kinds of cool dynamics happening there. So it kind of built some competition too. It was like healthy, but it was safe. It was psychologically safe. And then I think finally, just again, the meaning and purpose, they got to see what their work did. Even some of those folks who obviously passed away before they saw their fame, but they were seeing their statues, they were seeing their pieces up in the town, and just different things going forward. And just being part of this community was a really big deal for folks. So again, there's lots of easy ways we can do this in organizations, but it's really focusing on removing that friction and meeting those needs.
Beautiful, Tonille. And it's so inspiring. And that's the world that I want to help usher in as well. So this was a great way to kick us off. Let's grab our first break. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. We're on the air with Tonille Miller, a seasoned executive management consultant and organizational psychologist specializing in transformation, organizational effectiveness, and human performance. She is passionate about creating thriving ecosystems where businesses succeed because people are empowered to do the best work of their lives. We'll be right back. We've been talking a bit about the state of the possibilities of learning from the Medicis and that history. And next, after the break, we want to help you understand the disconnect for the workforce. What is their actual experience? We'll be right back. Or maybe we'll just keep going. Okay. All right. So let's dive into this second piece here. So what I wanted to talk about for this segment here, Tonille, as you know, is I want to really help our listeners and viewers understand what it's like for the workforce. As you said earlier, a lot of executives think they have a pretty good handle on what it is for the workforce is experiencing, but they really don't. So I like what you said before, that the workforce has outgrown today's company structure, operations, and leadership. So let's talk a little bit about really what does that mean?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, not to touch too much on what we already talked about, but again, a lot of our current workplace practices are still based. If you think about performance management, you think about just number of hours in the chair, all that stuff, that was based on industrial era workplace practices, right? So that was literally when you had to be in a factory, because that's where the work had to take place. Joe had to put his cog on here, and then Jane did her thing. Well, probably Jim, probably wasn't a Jane back in the day. Right. So you had to be in the space and you had to sit there all day. And so that's how it had to be. So I get it, right? That had to happen. That's not the case anymore. And so because of that, again, this distorted reality happens. And so I think one of the things to think about, if you think about that current experience, is I kind of break it down into 3 different buckets of what's causing this disengagement at such high levels. I think Gallup's, gosh, I don't know what it is today, but when I wrote the book, it was around like 85% of people are disengaged. And so if you think about the cost of that, it's like $9 trillion with a T. That's insane. So I say that just to give you that as a burning platform there. And so I break down into 3 buckets. So the first piece that's causing the problem, I think, is the organization provides this distorted reality, as we talked about in the beginning, right? So using those old ways of working, old formulas, old ways of measuring performance, return to the office, you have to be here, old technology, all that stuff is like, again, feels like a distorted reality inside the organization, because we all know that's not how the world is outside of it. So that's one piece that's really kind of, I think, messing with folks. The other part, as we, again, kind of alluded to, is these work practices that contradict human nature. So again, this is usually inadvertently, it's not usually on purpose, but like when we think about all the friction, all the frustrating the needs, like for autonomy, for growth, for agency, certainty, mastery, meaning, all that stuff, when that gets frustrated in the workplace, that also causes a big problem. And again, a lot of this treating adults like children, the return to office demands, micromanaging, not co-creating with people when you're launching changes or, doing things that are going to impact their role. A lot of that is done in the HR suite, right? Or it's done in private. It's not done with people. So a lot of my work in change management taught me that you want to bring in a cross section of people, especially the people that you think are going to be resistant to changes or different things you're trying to do. You bring them in early and you get them to just bring that stuff right out in the front. We're going to get it all in the open, and then we can actually proactively build like a resistance management plan into the change plan and the ways that we do things. So it's like, oh, we're going to address your concerns up front. Oh, you're going to be even more committed because you're building that change with us, right? And we listen to you. And I see this work like magic every time. So there's that piece. And then there's certain things like this. So just see if any of these ring true for anybody. So there's like treating people like value to be extracted, right? So when we think about layoffs, ghosting people that are applying for jobs, expecting superhuman, non-burnout expectations that you're always on, you're always doing all this stuff. Like, this is treating people like value to be extracted, not like people. And we all know we don't like that as a client or a customer. So we also know people don't like that as employees. So there's that. There's also, I think, one of the big hurdles here is the work itself often isn't as engaging, or it isn't engaging because it's been stripped of the autonomy, the creativity, the ownership, if you will, in return for standardizing it. And again, that standardization comes from the Industrial Revolution. It comes from factory floors, which is not the work we're doing today. Today, our people need to be creative. They need to be innovative, and that doesn't lend itself to that. And so the interesting part about this too, and I talk about this in the book, and I thought it was so funny, is that, when they went through, because again, before the Industrial Revolution, a lot of the work, to your point, was farming. It was artisans, it was artists, it was things like that, where people had lots of creativity, autonomy. They had the meaning and purpose because they saw how their product impacted the consumer, that type of thing. Well, when the Industrial Revolution came in, that stripped the work of all that stuff just to be consistent and standardized. And I think it was Adam Smith who said something around the lines of, he wanted the work to be how did he say it? He said it something like, become as stupid and ignorant as possible. Like, he wanted the work to be able to be for people who were not skilled, not trained. And we basically just need your hands to move these cogs on the thing. We don't need your brain. We don't want your brain. So there's that piece when you think about the lack of engagement. And then we have bad managers. There's plenty of stats around that. Again, treating people like children, I think, is a big theme here as well. And then I think a lot of folks talk about, I think Gallup talked about this, over half of employees say something like they don't know what's expected of them at work. So a lack of clarity. And it's like, well, how can I give you my best if I don't even know what I'm aiming for, kind of a thing. Right. And then I think the third bucket, and again, I'm rattling lots of stuff off here, so please just stop me along the way, but I want to make sure everyone gets all the data. But the other piece is like not taking it from an employee-centric lens, because we try to, if we're good as a company, we do this from a customer perspective pretty well, right? We build personas, we journey map them, we do spend all kinds of money and time and energy getting inside the customer's head, and that's great. But we don't really do that for our employees unless you're, an anomaly, which is rare. And so I always bring up the fact that, like, with leaders, is like one of the key tenets of this behavioral economics and persuasion psychology that we're trying to do with clients and customers is make it as easy as possible for people to do what you want them to do. And this works with your dog and your kids too, right? This works with everybody.
Right.
Right. But if we don't do that and we have all kinds of friction, as we mentioned earlier, bureaucracy, tons of meetings, lots of new tech, and we're not doing good change management around it, lots of emotional friction. If it feels like another job on top of their job, then this is an environment that's ripe for disengagement, of course, and burnout. So, so those are the kind of the big buckets. And then in that bucket too, is just kind of making a lot of companies I've seen where they make the leaders of the company, like the stars, like on the careers page, it's like, look at our awesome leadership team and look at how we're number one in this industry and all this stuff. And I'm thinking to myself, if I want to work there, do I care? I mean, maybe I do. I mean, maybe if I'm really into being the most customer-centric company in the world, and I think I'm going to go be the CEO, fine. But as the average junior employee, why do I care that you think your leadership team is great? You know what I mean? Like, why do we care about this kind of stuff? Like, we need to really make it more of the hero's journey type of thing, and make it the employee, the hero, and say, hey, you're the hero. This is the cool mission you're going to be on when you work in our company. And here's your manager, who's the guide, or however you want to phrase it, but like really positioning it in terms of the employee centric mindset. And so I think a lot of companies don't do that. And so those are kind of the bigger buckets that I see when it comes to the experience that are problems.
Okay. So let me chime in on a few of those things that I really want to kind of hammer home. Yeah. I hate to say it that way. That sounds terrible since we're talking about this. Bring home, shall we say. But, this whole idea, you talked about how the workplace is really designed for efficiency and surveillance. I mean, I still know companies that still are spying on their employees. That is, to me, just zero trust and just really should be eradicated from the planet. And, of course, the compliance factor. And so now what we get is, like, as you say, is we do get this tremendous burnout. I mean, burnout is something that more and more organizations are dealing with. You're going to see it in your higher healthcare premiums, people leaving the organization entirely or taking time away to try to get well again. Yeah. So the turnover, the disengagement. And then I really want you to speak a bit to this. I have never heard anybody say this before, Tonille, and I think it's so spot on. You say disengagement is a coping mechanism any healthy human would employ to avoid the cognitive dissonance or mental discomfort having to function in an environment where they find themselves unsafe, stifled, or having to otherwise live in a warped experience of reality many organizations create. I've never heard anybody say that it was a coping mechanism, and I totally embrace that.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that. Yeah, it was one of those things that just kind of just occurred to me, and it seemed like, how do people not get this? But again, they're not psychologists like us. So of course, they're not thinking that way probably. But, I just thought about it. I'm like, nobody wakes up every day and chooses to disengage from work. Like, they don't wake up and say, ooh, I'm going to spend all my time, a third of my life in a state of boredom, frustration, anxiety, stress, and alienation. They don't do that, right? Just to earn a paycheck, they're not doing that on purpose. And I think that disengagement, as we mentioned, is a coping mechanism because it helps them avoid the cognitive dissonance or mental discomfort, I would call it, in having to function in that environment where they find themselves unsafe or stifled or confused or warped reality that we talked about. It's like their brain, it's kind of like it's just like the subconscious, it's like not even conscious. It's like, oh my God, I have to function here. So I need to find a way to make it work, right? So I think they just kind of do it without even realizing it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then again, since we want to really bring home the experience of the employee, I want to talk about what you found with John Clifton, the CEO of Gallup. You quote him as saying, humanity's trying to figure out every way possible to get away from work. Employees aren't just emotionally detached, they're angry about what's happening in the workplace. And then you do quote the 85% disengaged figure. So, when you recognize people are coming to work angry, this is really not working, folks. I mean, Mayday, what do we need to do here to get your attention that this is not the way to go? I mean, and the cost that you put in there, and then you go on to say, and this, I really align with this, is that, you have this notion of course, how much time that we spend talking about these things. But you say, when you add up the $7.8 trillion cost of lost productivity due to disengaged employees, we're talking about 90% of the global GDP, nearly double the market cap of Google, Amazon, and Apple combined. And this is where it gets interesting from my vantage point. And that doesn't even account for the time, energy, and life stolen from each disengaged employee. Stolen.
Yep. And it doesn't have to be this way. That's the sick part. Like, And I don't think most leaders walk into work every day saying, ooh, I'm going to make everyone, feel like crap and I'm going to steal their life. No one's saying that, but it's because people aren't deliberate about this. And unfortunately, there aren't enough people like you and I who are actually, I would recommend a C-level role in the organization that looks across the entire vantage point. I'm not talking just an HR leader, because unfortunately there's some really great ones, But most of the HR, first of all, it's it's firefighting and it's reacting to this and it's payroll and it's often not that strategic, unfortunately. And so we need someone that can see the vantage point at the C level across everything. And it's very much the employee experience. It's all the stuff we're talking about. They partner with IT, with the chief commercial officer, with everybody to understand how it, just like you would understand every step of the customer journey, you need to understand every step, every moment of the employee journey and bring them in.
Yes.
Listen to them.
Yes. And then, the last thing I want to talk about for this particular segment is I don't understand why we have all of these large organizations having a forced mandate return to the office. During the pandemic, we actually talked about well-being. Even Gallup moved and talked, away from engagement to well-being. To me, when I see these forced mandates, there's no way that they're taking into consideration what the employee needs and how they can flourish. It's a one-sided view. I want you here. I want your derriere in this seat at this time. What happened, Tonille? Why did we lose the mooring there? And what is causing, do you think, that fierce just return back to like the rubber band trying to snap back to where it was?
Yes. Oh my God. I feel like every time I've talked about this in the last 5 years, my answer is different moment to moment, because as we see different news stories and different companies are making different demands at different times. And we've gone back and forth, as you mentioned, with the rubber band. Oh, now employees have the power, they say, because there's a tougher job market to find people. Oh, now it's a tougher job market, all this stuff. And so unfortunately, that's not the game we should be playing. That's not the game that is being played, but that's the game that leaders are trying to play. And so the thing is to your point, it's just, I'm almost nauseous when I talk about this now, because it's like, I just don't get it. I've spoken to a lot of them. A lot of the work I've done in the last 5 years has been around helping companies transition to that more hybrid model and not, rescind and not go back in their tracks. And unfortunately, the ones that are, especially lately, they're bringing it all back, bringing the demands back. There's a lot of things here. I think one of the biggest things is, as we know, it's not rocket science. They're just not comfortable. They don't believe, they don't trust that people are working. They don't know how to lead. I've had some of them pull me aside and said, hey, privately, I just don't feel important. If I don't have people in the office kind of scurrying around and I look important, honestly, candidly, I don't feel important if I'm not there telling people what to do. What's my purpose? And so I'm like,
wow.
Right. And I think that's more common than we realize. So there's the old school mindset where this is how I, grew up and I don't know how to lead any other way. But guess what? We can get upskilled. We can get podcasts. We can get books. We can get coaching, like all the things. So it's just kind of like that. I think there's a lot of ego involved with some of them, a lot of them that are doing it. I do think it's ego, especially in the last 5-6 months or so that they're doing it again. But unfortunately, they are going to long term. It's such a short game, I think. And I do think that this is just like, I think Brene Brown calls this power over's last stand. So it's like the last stand. We're just clinging to this, what we think is our power. And unfortunately, they're losing their top talent, because when they do that, who leaves? Top talent.
Yeah.
Right. They're going to
have many other options. Yeah.
Yeah. And they have other options, and they know that how they work best and all this stuff. Top talent, especially in today's economy that needs creativity and innovation, et cetera, they don't flourish when they're being told to sit in a chair for a certain number of hours a day for an arbitrary reason and check a box and whatever. Like, that's not really the kind of talent. That's what you should be getting robots and AI to be doing. Right. So I think what organizations need to be doing, and I know they're going to get there, it's just taking some time, is really focusing on one way to solve this problem, I think, is instead of focusing on hours and all these old school mindsets of how we measure performance, let's find out what the real metrics are, the real KPIs that actually move the needle. What is the things that make the impact? And then measure performance on that. And then who cares when, where, how, what they do to work. But because we don't do that, and because leaders don't have that to reach for quickly, they go back to the way that things were. So I think that would actually be a good solve for this.
Okay, I think that's very powerful. All right, let's grab our break here. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. We've been on the air with Tonille Miller. She's a seasoned executive management consultant and organizational psychologist specializing in transformation, organizational effectiveness, and human performance. She's passionate about creating thriving ecosystems where businesses succeed because people are empowered to do the best work of their lives. We've been talking about what the experience is like of the actual employees who you depend on to get the work done and realize the mission of your organization. After the break, we're going to bring it home and help you by giving you some information on how companies and leadership can rise to meet the needs of today's evolved workforce and thus succeed mightily. We'll be right back.
Dr. Elise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Elise to speak to your organization, please visit her at elisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Elise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Elise, send an email to Elise, A-L-I-S-E, at elisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us and welcome back to Working on Purpose. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. As I too, like Tonille, am dedicated to helping create a world where people realize their potential at work, are led by inspirational leaders who help them find and contribute their greatness, and we do business that betters the world. I keep researching and writing my own books, so my last one came out in 2023. It's called The Great Revitalization, How Activating Meaning and Purpose Can Radically Enliven Your Business. And like Tonille, it's really designed to help leaders understand how the world of work and the workforce has changed, and then provides 22 best practices to fold into your culture to create that for them. You can find my books on Amazon or my website, elisecortez.com. If you are just joining us, my guest is Tonille Miller. She's the author of The Flourishing Effect, Unlocking Employee Thriving as Your Competitive Advantage. So, of course, in the last segment, we talked about what it was like for the employee. And for this segment, I want to start helping our listeners and viewers think about ways they can start to meet the evolved needs of today's workforce. And the first thing that you talk about is the importance of updating your operating system to meet the moment. And also, which includes when you do want people back in the office, give them a reason to be there.
Yes. And this is something that I think is really interesting and really important, because again, we can complain all day long about the fighting of who's right, this and that, but I think we need to offer real solutions. So the first thing I would say is, again, give them that reason to come to the office. And a few of these things that come to mind from my perspective is make the office a high profile destination, right? So this is something that leaders can do, right? Make it the cool place to go, right? So it's like, it's long been this mundane, boring place where you just kind of have to come every day. But what if instead it was like a place where people are really eager to visit, right? And they heard great things are happening there and they felt like they're kind of missing out if they weren't there. So you can do this by really curating connections, exposure to leaders, and offering, I guess, I would call it tailored kind of epic experiences, right? So this could be like guest speakers or things like that, and really just creating this environment that fosters that creativity, the collaboration, that type of thing. Because again, we can all work great at home or in our little coffee shops or whatever, but when we want to collaborate and come into like a really cool place, I think that's one way you can do it, is just build a place that looks and feels like that and people are buzzing about it. And then I think with that, like you kind of would want to have a full calendar of experiential events is what I would call it, right? So things that they can't really get at home, they really want to come to the office for. So again, some of my clients have done things like they've had concerts, escape rooms, volunteer community events, speakers, again, as I mentioned, things like that. And I think that really helps out, especially if it's done ahead of time and people know ahead of time, they have a calendar to look at and kind of plan their visit. I think the other piece here, again, is just number one, curating the connection. Like, why are they coming in? Giving them a reason to, right? Helping them understand what's the reason, what's the purpose. Maybe it's a working session, whatever. But again, creating that connection is really big here. Let's see, what else? I think, again,
one more thing that you've got to talk about. This is so cool. Choose your own adventure career paths.
Yes.
Right? So many people wanted, I guess, from my research, they leave their manager and they leave because they're not learning and growing. And I love this idea of choosing your own adventure career path. If you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is especially what the younger generation is already doing on the side. So why not do it in your organization to keep them engaged, right? Because you have more resources to do so. But again, we all know this, like one size fits all career ladders. Again, this old ways of working thing, it's not working anymore. And so with that, they don't necessarily want the same thing that other generations wanted, right? Where it's like very linear and traditional. Instead, we want to create growth in their earning power and their achievements, right? So they want to give them freedom. We want to give them all kinds of different ways to learn. And I can talk through some of those, what those look like, but there's like all kinds of things like career marketplaces, reverse mentoring, and embracing their side gig or their side hustle, that type of thing. Like there's all kinds of different ways we can do this, but really offering them these ways of kind of lateral moves, trying things on in different areas. And then with that, not just saying, here's another thing, because again, they want to do different things and learn new things because they know at the end of the day, they're not getting that pension. They're not staying there forever. We all know that. So they want to be more valuable when they leave your organization. And so giving them these opportunities to learn and stretch and grow in different ways is going to be really valuable.
Mm-hmm. Love that. That's so great. Okay, next, this is, of course, you can't get off the air without talking about purpose with me, right? Mm-hmm. And I love how you situate it as the North Star people can believe in. And I find I'm so amazed, Tonille. There's so many organizations that recognize, yeah, purpose is really important. Oh yeah, we've got this purpose statement, but we're not living, nobody knows anything about what it means, right? So, but more and more of the workforce and the consumers are more intentional and discerning about the companies they choose to associate with. And they want to align on those values for what they buy and where they go to work. So can you say a little bit more about just how to activate purpose?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first, I just want to throw one little side note in here too, is that I think a lot of people, especially leaders, they hear the word purpose and they think of it like culture, right? Oh yeah, we know it's important, but they don't really understand what it is. And they don't really understand that it's actually a very strategic tool.
Right.
Do it the right way. If you're deliberate about it and you really focus on it, it does a couple of things, right? So the purpose of purpose is how I frame it is it's a strategic tool to guide the organization. It can build trust, it can garner respect, it can inspire motivation, pride, and commitment, right? So the way that I kind of think about that is it guides leaders, again, by serving as that North Star, right? So that kind of helps them understand, okay, when there's some social issue in the media, do they speak out on it or do they not, right? If it doesn't align with their purpose, they probably shouldn't be speaking about it. If it does, then they may want to. It builds trust because it lets people know what to expect from you. That could be your employees as well as your shareholders, that type of thing. It unites stakeholders because they know, oh yeah, well, we want profit. If we think about like capitalism, right? Conscious capitalism, it's like, well, we know that this is our purpose. So according to that, then you stakeholders over here need to get on board. Like it offers, I think, a non-emotional, very objective way to be very strategic in nature and really give people that perspective and really giving them something to believe in, right? Because again, it's one of those things where it's like, as you mentioned, whether you're a consumer or an employee, you really want to know that your hours or dollars really matter in today's world. And so there's a lot of ways you can do this. A lot of companies do it, but I think one really good example is Unilever. They actually did what I would call, they get bonus points because they not just developed their own purpose as a company, which a lot of companies do have a quote purpose, but they actually said, let's take it a step further and let's hold some workshops and do some exercises with our executive team first. And later on, they did it with the entire company, but they rolled it out and they basically, in these smaller workshops, they helped through facilitation, understand what each individual employee's purpose was. Like they kind of worked through that exercise. And then at the end of it, they connected each of those purposes to the organizational purpose. And so that's really the most powerful thing ever.
Right. I totally know because I do that as well. I want to also throw in that little pot as a great example, the Mexican bakeries organization, Bimbo. They operate in 22 different countries around the world. They have, at last count, 130,000 employees. And because the founder recognized that this isn't a company, it's an organization of combined souls. They do a similar exercise when they onboard. They have their people learn to discover, detect their own purpose and their values, and look for how can they thread that through and with that of the organization to therefore expand themselves. And I think it's tremendous, so tremendous.
Love that.
Right, I did too. So I have just a couple more things I want to get from you before you go, because there's so much value here. But I have to have you talk about the chapter. It's called "The King Has Been Dethroned: A Fundamental Shift in Leadership." Just the importance first of leading yourself first. Can you talk about a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a thing that I actually am writing a second book right now, and I'm talking a lot about the individual level, right? So not just as a leader, but as any person on an individual level, you have to lead yourself first. So that means a lot of things, but basically just on a basic level, super self-awareness, do all the assessments you can, do all the reflecting, all the journaling, all the different, there's so much out there resource-wise, you could GPT it, whatever you want, but get to know yourself and your motivations, your blind spots, your zones of genius, your shadow, all that stuff. Like that is number one, especially as a leader, because all that stuff is going to come out in the workplace if you're not aware of it, right? So we need to do that. Number one, lead yourself. And then also with that too, understanding, like, cause so many leaders, they praise themselves and each other on, ooh, I hustled and grind and didn't sleep for 3 days. This is so great. I'm like, no, it's not great, because we all know that is coming out in your workforce and your people are feeling it, it's not good. It's not good for your health. It's not good for your well-being. You're probably snapping at people, all kinds of things. So just, again, leading yourself first, very simple. But once you fill your own cup, then you have the resources and the ability to pay it forward, right? And really help focus on other people and be developing them and focusing on that bigger picture. So the number one thing is just do that, because I think it'll help you really overcome your ego in a lot of cases too.
Yeah. And I also, like, I believe very strongly in getting, you talk about in your book, getting these outside sources outside your usual circle. I always have at least 2 coaches that I'm working with for myself.
Nice.
And then you also talk about just recognizing you are no longer the hero, your people are. And then you talk about being a meaning maker, helping people recognize how they matter. Of course, Zach McCurry has been on my program. He's coming back a bit again later. He's known for that kind of work. There's so much that you can do to be an effective leader and not, be dethroned in your work and therefore be more effective. Mm-hmm. I really want to talk about this. I think this is probably going to be our last point here is I love the idea, and I think this should be the promise of every organization, is to make your people a better version of themselves, activate their strengths, their potential, and their mastery. Let's just spend a little bit of time talking about that.
Yeah. I mean, I came across this stat when I was writing it that they said only 5% of people feel like they are meeting their full potential at work. Yep. Think about that. 5%.
Yeah, it's crazy.
5%. And companies are complaining all the time, oh, we're not productive enough. We're not this and that. And I'm like, you're only leveraging 5% of your people and they're getting stifled and leaving because of it. They're underwhelmed. And that's a cause of burnout as well, right? Just feeling underutilized. Mm-hmm. It's such a big deal. It's such a big opportunity for both the company and for the people. And so in the book on that chapter, I make it a point to really talk about like some really interesting, cool ways that I've seen companies do this. And again, low, no cost options here. So again, personal purpose, right? We already talked about this, aligning the purpose. Just it literally doesn't cost anything. It's just helping people. It's just how we discuss it and connecting the dots and helping people see how their work fits that purpose. Job crafting, Amy Resnisti's work is really cool.
Know her work. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yep. People can go Google it if you don't know it. It's really impactful. Internal marketplaces, apprenticeship programs, reverse mentoring, again, embracing their side hustles. I mean, I've worked with clients where they actually are so transparent with their people that their people tell them their side hustles. And one of them even funds some of their side hustles into parts of their business. So like, there's so many different ways you can do that. But the point is, because the social contract is different, people aren't staying forever. They need, again, to feel more valuable when they leave you than when they came to you, which means you need to really focus on this.
Yeah. I love this. You also talk about peer coaching as being another thing. Mm-hmm. I also loved what you talked about Netflix, your L&D department, right? Gone are the days of relying solely on traditional training methods, but to upscale your workforce using these other ways, these other dynamic ways to keep them learning. I love that as well. Mm-hmm. Let's see, we are pretty close to the end here, but maybe you could just say a little bit about this. You've got a chapter, Purpose in Every Job, the Art of Meaning Making. We've talked a little bit about this already, but can you just say maybe a couple of things about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we all are aware. I mean, I personally think it's a human need. It's not just a Gen Z need or a millennial need, but correct, that's what the media talks about. But it's all of us as humans. We all have a need for meaning and purpose, as you know, with the logotherapy and yes. That's a whole podcast in its own, I hope. But the good news is there's so many ways. Again, as you are building this into the work for your people that costs nothing, it's simple things like the manager connecting the dots, showing Joe his picture, his spreadsheet, and how that impacts the client or how it impacts this upstream team or whatever. Just connecting dots for people, showing them they matter. David Burkus, psychologist, does some great work on highlighting interdependence, helping people see how their inputs contribute to people's output or, whatever the case may be. And just simple things like that, shared purpose on a team to get the team rallied around it. There's all kinds of really interesting ways you can do this, but it's just a matter of how you language the work, basically. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you talk about languaging, talk about sense making, really helping people recognize you're overlooking the actual employee experience and you're missing the chance to really unleash that intrinsic motivation when people see, to your point, how they're connected to the bigger mission of the organization. I also liked, in terms of making it the return on experience for the offices, you bring in customers or clients to showcase and share how they've been impacted by what the company does. When people see that, I mean, that was really powerful idea as well from your book.
Yeah. And clients love it. That's the thing is clients are like, oh, this is so cool. Like I'm a case study, right? I think Bill George was the former CEO of Medtronic. He literally at the Christmas party every year would bring, because again, Medtronic, medical devices, he'd bring some of the folks that were patients and use the device on stage just to tell a quick story. And everybody got to see, oh my God, every day when I'm QAing this or doing that, it makes little Susie's heartbeat. You know what I mean?
Right,
It's like,
right. I know. And Bill George is a love. He's been on my podcast as well. He's a love.
So
okay, we've come to the end of the show already. It happens so fast. Say in 30 seconds, what would you like to leave them with, Tonille?
Well, I'm writing a bit about this in my next book. As I mentioned, it's how individuals can flourish. And I think the number one thing is, first, self-realization. As we mentioned, the self-awareness, realizing who you are, what you need, all that stuff. Then you move into alignment, right? Making sure you're always operating from that place as much as possible. So you're filling your own cup, listening to your intuition, all that stuff is foundation. Then you move into actualization, right? So as you grow in life, you accumulate success, wealth, skills, etc. And the fourth point is transcendence. You can actually pay those things forward and help others. So that's really my focus these days.
I love that. And you're coming back on my podcast then. You can run from me, but you can't hide. I'm pretty fast. Tonille, thank you so much for being who you are, for putting this beautiful book in the world, doing the work that you're doing, for coming on, working on purpose. A delight to know you and share your work.
Thank you so much for having me.
Very welcome. Listeners and viewers, you are going to want to know more about Tonille Miller, the work she does as a management consultant and organizational psychologist, and her latest book, The Flourishing Effect. So you can see her at two different places. She has two different websites. One is her personal site. That's her name, TonilleMiller.com. Let me spell that for you. TONILLE Miller.com. And then also her site, experienceandtransformation.com. Last week, if you missed the show last week, we were on air with Dr. Ross Blankenship, an organizational psychologist, executive coach, and a lecturer at the University of Virginia. We talked about his book, Everyday Leadership, A Guide to Developing Your Mindset as a Leader. He shared his perspective on the basic behaviors leaders are responsible for and how a leadership mindset can be developed to be more effective. Next week, we'll be on the air with Patricia Grabarek talking about her new book, Leading for Wellness, How to Create a Team Culture Where Everyone Thrives. See you there. And remember, work is one of the best adventures and means of realizing our potential and making the impact we crave. It can give us the opportunity to do business in a way that betters the world. So let's work on purpose.
We hope you've enjoyed this week's program. Be sure to tune into Working on Purpose, featuring your host, Dr. Elise Cortez, each week on W4CY. Together, we'll create a world where business operates conscientiously, leadership inspires impassioned performance, and employees are fulfilled in work that provides the meaning and purpose they crave. See you there. Let's work on purpose.